Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen. This is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. Tonight we're going to be celebrating a couple of Christmas classics. 1974's Black Christmas, directed by Bob Clark, celebrating its 50th anniversary, and Silent Night, Deadly Night from 1984, directed by Charles Sellier, celebrating its 40th anniversary. Ho, ho, ho.
Do you remember when we first met? You told me about you wanting to be a concert pianist, how it was your greatest dream. And I told you about some of the things that I wanted to do. I still want to do those things.
Who is it?
Jean, get the children in the car. There was a little girl murdered over in the park tonight.
Mrs. Quaid and Mr. Harrison have asked me to extend their thanks to you for coming out on this cold night to help. Now, Mrs. Quaid has told us that Janice most likely came through this park on her way home from school today.
You think it's my fault, don't you? Barb, stop it.
I really don't think you should provoke somebody like that, Barb.
Come on, I know a professional version when I see one. You think that I drove her away? And if she's dead, you're gonna blame me. Barb, for God's sake.
A high school girl's been murdered. Mr. Harrison's daughter is missing. And now at the house where she lives, the other girls are getting obscene phone calls.
Peter, I don't want to marry you.
Don't you ever consider anyone but yourself?
Just know Clara's dead. I can just feel it.
You're gonna have to keep this guy on the line as long as possible. We got a mechanical system here and it takes a while. I'm going to kill you.
Get out! Don't go upstairs, Jess! Miss Bradford! Miss Bradford!
It's time for our happy sleigh ride, and that's S-L-A-Y ride, with these two Christmas classics. And let's bring everybody in. We got an awesome panel to chat about them with me. So let's say hello to Mackenzie Parker.
Hello.
Ian Simmons.
Hello.
Tim Pallas.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Kira Wiley.
Hello.
And putting the Chris in Christmas, Chris Scales.
Season's greetings.
And we are going to be chatting about Black Christmas from 1974, celebrating its 50th anniversary, and Silent Night, Deadly Night from 1984, celebrating its 40th anniversary. Thanks for coming on the shore, buddy, and welcome. I have been waiting for this one literally all year long. Like, as soon as I put it on the calendar, I was like, oh, that's going to be super fun. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. And Mac, I'm actually going to toss the ball to you because you are responsible for that amazing opening trailer that we saw. So thank you for putting that together. How did you come to encounter Black Christmas for the first time?
It was around 2018, the late summer of 2018. I was watching the news and the Kavanaugh hearings happened to be on. And I was like, well, I'm gonna do something, have a little green friend and watch a horror movie to take my mind off of the realities of the day. And I thought about the 2006 Black Christmas remake, which I had seen years ago, and all I could remember was that it's very pretty and it's got a lot of color. So I was like, I'm gonna look that up and watch that. But all I could find was the original. So I was like, and I'd never seen it, so I was like, well, I guess I'll. It says Margot Kidder, so I guess I'll settle for the original. And yeah, within like 20 minutes, I knew it was probably going to be one of my favorite movies, top 10 maybe. And there's this particular shot in the movie that happened where I was like, this is one of my favorite movies I've ever seen. And it doesn't matter how it ends. This is already just one of my favorites. I fell hard for this movie. I think I actually messaged you not long after and was just like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Like,
I was like, welcome to the fold.
Yes.
Ian, I know you're a big slasher fan. How did this film come to you?
It's weird because I was co-hosting a horror convention dinner with a previous panelist and dear friend Chad Hawks in Minneapolis. And Margot Kidder was one of the guests. And I realized that the only movies I think I'd seen of hers were the Superman films. So I watched this and I think Amityville, and so yeah, it was a bit of homework. And in doing that homework, I discovered, wow, this is great. And I think the Bob Clark connection of him having done, Porky's as well as A Christmas Story, that came later during some additional research. But yeah, the guy 3 for 3 as far as I'm concerned.
Margot Kidder appeared in Sisters, which Mac and I talked about last year for one of the panels.
Yep, that was part of the homework too. That's right.
Yep, Yep. Tim, how about you?
Kind of a movie I'd always heard of, and then I had a membership at a video club, and just going through everything I hadn't seen, eventually I hit that. And yeah, like it was mentioned earlier, just while watching it, I immediately knew this is going to be one of my favorite movies. And yeah, I've loved it ever since, probably about 15 years now.
Cool. And Kira, how about you? Thanks for coming on the show. It's your first time joining us.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. So I had, when I was a kid and getting into horror movies, all of my access to horror movies was kind of like whatever was on the shelf at my local Blockbuster that I could persuade someone's older brother to rent. So I watched a lot of, stuff that was coming out in the early 2000s. And it took me until I was a young adult to kind of get into some of the classics. But because of that, I had the privilege of getting to see a lot of them in like small independent movie theaters. So in 2015, I saw for the first time a double feature of Black Christmas and Silent Night, Deadly Night at the New Bev in LA, which is a yearly tradition, which was, and it was, I believe it was in 35 millimeter, and it was absolutely the best way to do that. So I was very spoiled with my first viewing.
That's pretty good. That's hard to top.
Yeah.
Chris, how about you?
My first viewing came upon just, going back through, it was a personal journey of films that came out before I was born. And, along that line came stuff like that I hadn't seen before, like Suspiria at the time. While I was actually doing some research on Halloween, I heard about this movie that John Carpenter kind of admitted to kind of cribbing from, and it was called Black Christmas. And I was like, what is Black Christmas? And then I had heard a lot of people talk about it being like one of the grandfathers of slasher films, holiday slasher films at that. So, naturally I went and found it and I absolutely fell in love with it. It seems like even today that I feel like I pick something up a little more every time I watch it. And, these days, we have numerous showings. We have showings that have featured some of the cast members. I actually did go to one with Olivia Hussey, and ever since then, just watched it. Watched the 2006 version, and that was what it was. And then, literally last night, to prepare for this, watched the 2019 version, and I don't know if we'll get to that whenever, but that was pretty much my journey with Black Christmas.
Sweet. Yeah, it was one that I think I had kind of heard about, but it didn't seem like a lot of folks were talking about it maybe 20, 30 years ago when I was really digging into horror films as an adult. And when I came to it, similar to your experience, Mac, as you're watching it, you're like, this is kind of amazing. Like, this isn't just a good slasher. This is a great movie. The way that Bob Clark moves the camera. And then you start, as a seasoned horror fan, you start recognizing, wait a minute, this POV thing, hang on a second. And wait a minute, the calls coming from inside the house. And you just start checking this list of and you're like, wait, this came out when? Wait, this predates all of that. And that was really exciting. But of course, sparked that idea of well, why doesn't this one get the same kind of love? Why wasn't a huge box office success in the way that Halloween and Friday the 13th were? And I hope we'll talk some about that over the course of the conversation. But yes, I think it is just one of those magical, great films. And it's Bob Clark's, last stab at horror films. basically he kind of moved on from there and made things like Porky's and Christmas Story and, Baby Geniuses. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the basic setup. Kira, would you mind kind of like giving us a little setup for what Black Christmas is about?
Black Christmas follows some sorority sisters in a sorority house who are being harassed by a mysterious caller who calls with some very disturbing dialogue, and slowly they start to disappear and be killed, and they band together in a very fun way to try and kind of figure out what is happening to their sorority sisters as they slowly start dropping off the map.
Thank you. Well done. So let's talk about those phone calls, because those are very striking, and they are something I don't think I've seen anything like that in subsequent films. There is something about those phone calls that brings such menace, such energy. And something I noticed on this most recent viewing was that they say he's calling again. And this is supposedly, like we've seen him get into the house, like we watched him get into the house. And it's like, wait, has he been coming in and out of this house before?
Mhm.
Or has he been calling from somewhere else? So it was like that just light bulb went off in my head.
I mean, they are very disturbing because it's, it's like dialogue between, two or possibly more people. There's different voices. It's not just the stereotypical kind of heavy breathing that we've heard in other, cases like this. The thing that, if I would say, the one major plot hole or issue that I have with the film is, especially when you realize that, or I guess the girls realize that the call is coming from inside the house. These calls are not quiet. They are screaming and yelling, and they're like upstairs, and you're like, there's no, I mean, the score is not heavy. Of course, the score is not, part of these characters' reality. So it's probably a pretty quiet house.
Sure.
So how do you not hear that upstairs?
Good, strong Canadian architecture.
That's right.
That has to be.
You have to have all that insulation, because of the winters.
The other, I guess, related to that, I'm not sure. This is slightly off topic. I don't know how long our first victim was up in that attic. The plastic wrap around the head will do something, but I mean, that body's going to start to smell, and those hands were not covered. But no, the calls were very effective. Let me just kind of backtrack and say it was an interesting experience to see that this is a place where a lot of these kind of tropes came from. But on the other hand, because I came to this so late in my horror watching experience, I wasn't grabbed by them. It was one of those situations where I wish I was around back in 1974 to experience this, because It's like, oh, there's this cliche and that cliche and this cliche, but you have to like kind of rewire your brain to say, no, these aren't cliches at this point.
I have to say that when I first saw it and those phone calls started coming in, I was actually pretty shocked because I was still pretty young at the time, but even some of the words that they were using in that dialogue or on those phone calls, I was like, they said this stuff back in 1974.
Right.
I was young and naive. I didn't know. And so I went and just kind of like I do with most of the horror films I watch, I went and kind of looked up some of the trivia and discovered that they actually added those phone calls. What you hear on the film was added after post-production, and to get the reactions out of the girls, I think it was Bob Clark and it was
Pure Delay.
Thank you. Yes, they were yelling really obscene and horrible things at the girls off screen to get them to give the proper reactions. And once I saw all of that, I was just like, man, this is great. That is a really well done idea for post production, is to make something even more disturbing that just it sounds right at home in 2024 that it did in 1974.
Tim, any thoughts about phone calls or cast members?
About the point that you mentioned, that struck me last night when I was watching it, that they're saying he's calling again. So I was thinking about that, and it could be the girl that they find in the park. He called after that, but then it's also like, how did he get the number to this house? If maybe the number had been jotted down next to that phone in the sorority house, and that's what he was calling. But how did he know it before then? So that had me thinking last night as like kind of the only thing I couldn't figure out. But the calls themselves I find really effective. I was reading about it. There's 3 different voices that they recorded for these, including Bob Clark, a woman, and I forget the name of
Nick
the main.
Mancuso.
Yeah. So yeah, just the way that was put together was really effective, and yeah, I think I read it was the first mainstream movie to use the word cunt, Chris. So so yeah, it was a bit shocking to me too the first time I watched it.
Well, it's funny you mentioned mainstream. I mean, because really this was a low budget Canadian film. It was able to go, I mean, and I think Bob Clark was intentionally looking to push the envelope to be shocking because he knew he could get away with it. And that's, this is definitely something we should talk about, is the fact that it's a Canadian production. And one of the first major Canadian productions to kind of come over and have a release, although it didn't have the success stateside that it did in Canada. It was a big hit there, but it was kind of this kind of sleeper hit on the US side of things.
I mean, to me, I think the phone calls are easily the scariest part of the movie. I mean, we've got all these kill scenes, including the incredible kill scene with the unicorn, but the phone calls to me are what immediately struck me watching this. And part of it is because, you know, like, probably most women have experienced something like that. You've had, you've had obscene phone calls, or you've had somebody say something to you on a train or something like that. And the visceral reaction you have. And that first scene when he calls during the party and all of them are gathered around the phone, and the ways each of these women react is such sharp writing to me, because, you know, you've got Barb, who like wants to humiliate him in return, who like wants to make fun of him and like turn it into a joke. And, you know, you've got Claire, who's just like disgusted and horrified. And so, yeah, I mean, like, that scene to me felt so natural, because you do have all those feelings of like disgust and anger, but also fear, and like what is this person's intention. I think they're just brilliantly done, and so scary.
I feel like the first time watching it, I was sort of playing this game of like, where are we in, like, I know it's 1974, but like, is this going to be like watching a Hitchcock movie, you know, where it's like it's fun, but it's not really like, you know, it's like an antique piece, you know, and like the acting of somebody like Mrs. Mack feels at home in a Hitchcock movie, but then there's like Margot Kidder, who feels very like new wave and you know, that very post late 60s, early 70s thing. So I'm like doing this thing of like, where are we now in like cinema? You know, how far are we gonna go? And then those phone calls happen, and yeah, like, it's 4 years since MASH, since somebody said fuck in a movie for the first time, and the last detail, and now it's like, yeah, that's being said in the phone calls. And like I said, I had just been watching those Kavanaugh hearings, so like that was very in the front of my brain of just like the way men treat women. And so like the movie is just like, how many degrees of the way that men treat women do you get throughout the movie? And that start with those phone calls of just like this awful. And like that shot, like she said, of like that shot that just pans over all their faces while they listen to it. And it's like, it's chilling. It's absolutely chilling. And like you said about like the conventions of the slasher, it's like they're all there in Black Christmas, but it's the interesting thing to me is the way that they didn't get translated into newer slashers or even into Halloween, where it's like you go into most horror movies with the understanding that sex equals death, but then you have a lead who's pregnant, and there's so much empathy for women throughout Black Christmas that you don't expect. It's such a surprising movie to watch.
Well, and I think that's a great opportunity to kind of talk about the characters here, because we do genuinely get to know, and we like these characters. They don't feel like they're just carbon copies of one another like we would come to have. I mean, I think Halloween, we have a really nice distinction between those 3 characters, but here we have double that. We have Jess, played by Olivia Hussey. We have Phyllis, played by Andrea Martin.
Barb
by Margot Kidder. Yep. Andrea
Well,
Martin,
John Saxton.
Phyllis. Oh yes, and definitely John Saxon.
John Saxon, baby. And the camera like swivels around, and it suddenly you see him looking very similar, but a little sexier than he is in The Nightmare on Elm Street. I was just like, oh my god, this is my favorite movie ever.
Well, and you had two pretty big stars in Olivia Hussey and Keir Dullea. Both of them were coming off of pretty big movies with Romeo and Juliet and 2001 Space Odyssey. And so we get those great characters that we actually relate to, and they don't feel just like paint by numbers. Somebody mentioned Margot Kidder's kind of raunchy approach, and I think that's kind of exciting and fun for an audience.
I think she's a character that in like later slasher movies, like I can't think of the character's name in House on Sorority Row, who's kind of this unlikable, you know, like I think she's sort of a progenitor, or she's an antecedent of Barb. But like Barb is so lovable, like no matter what she says or does, you're so charmed by her, and it's so different than what you expect.
Well, and Barb has that really telling moment of vulnerability. That's one of my favorite moments in the movie, after she gets off the phone with her mother and she goes to her friends. And you see her putting up this like defensive front with her mom and, you know, saying these things to her mom about how she doesn't care. And then she tries to be really dismissive about it. Like, oh, who wants to go skiing? And letting her have that moment of like, oh no, she's not 100%, you know, she's got a little heart in there. She's hurt. I love that for her.
Mr. Harrison, when he's at the table and, you know, he's eating dinner and he's like, I can't really eat. And then Barb goes on this kind of drunken tirade and she's, you know, she's being filthy. And then all of a sudden she just, at the snap of a finger, she turns and the scene turns really dark and you really start to feel for her. You start to feel for her character. And she gives not just the darkness, but she also provides such humor throughout that film. And especially one of my favorites of all time, that fellatio exchange joke. It still cracks me up. And John Saxton and his like lieutenant or whatever, towards the end of the film, just busting out and laughing at it during a pivotal scene of the film.
It comes up later too when John Saxon's in the house and he's like, is Barb the one that was in the station earlier? And John Saxon again, he laughs and he's like, well, we'll let her rest, you know. Man, that joke has long legs, man.
Well, it's interesting because that joke, I'm not sure if this is a screenplay thing or an ad lib or whatever, but a version of that joke shows up later in Bob Clark's Porky's. The prank phone call to, you know, is Mike Hunt here? You know, it's very similar. I'm not the biggest fan of Barb as a person from what we gather here. I think she's abrasive. I wouldn't call her charming, but she's entertaining. But I think it was very wise of the screenwriter to dispose of her in the way that they did, because I think she's a much stronger character than Jess. I think in a fair fight, our killer would have given him a run for the money. And the fact that she's unconscious, she wakes up, you know, having an asthma attack, and then is, you know, kind of snuck up upon and stabbed to death with a crystal unicorn. I mean, it's tragic. But it's also strange that we don't see the climactic fight between Jess and quote unquote Billy. It reminds me of what the Coen brothers did at the end of No Country for Old Men, where you're building towards this. The whole point of the movie is this, you know, kind of Rashomon, what happened during this big confrontation, and we don't see the confrontation. We see the aftermath of the bodies strewn everywhere. We kind of see that here, where the cops bust in and, you know, his body is slumped over hers, and for a second you're not sure if they're both dead. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with the characters here, and I feel like the legacy of this movie is that a lot of the slashers afterwards just got rid of all that character stuff and focused on the body count and the creative kills, which this movie also has, but not as many as you might expect from, oh, this is the grandfather of the slasher film. It's pretty tame. Some of it's shocking, but as far as the body count, that's later. That's Friday the 13th territory.
Yeah. And Doug McGrath plays Sergeant Nash, and he does show up again in Porky's, and he is one of those who is having that laughing fit. You know, you have that contagious laughter. He's just on the other side of it this time around. That scene in Porky's is one of my favorites. And
I
so
love
it's
that.
fun to see that kind of carry over from, Bob Clark going, that thing we did back in Black Christmas, that could work again.
The echo of that lieutenant's laugh. Like, I just love 70s movies, and there's just something so like Hal Ashby, Robert Altman naturalistic about like the way all that feels and plays out and the humor throughout the movie. Man, I like the movie a lot, guys.
Yeah. I mean, John Saxon was he was offered the role mistakenly, and then Edmund O'Brien was actually given the role. And Edmund O'Brien showed up the day before, and he was exhibiting signs of early Alzheimer's. And he didn't know where he was. He was they were at a bar, and he was like, "I'm going to go upstairs to my room." They're like, "We're not at your hotel. Like we're at a bar right now." And he kept going like he needed to go upstairs. So they had to fire him, and they called John Saxon. He literally flew in, and that day, like he went from the airport into wardrobe onto the set, and he does that first scene out in the park where they're going to be looking for the missing girl. And that's why he gets that also starring credit, where it's like, give that guy anything he wants.
Yeah, I read the composer pulled him in. He had worked with him on a previous film.
Carl Zitterer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And boy, the music in this is another amazing piece.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of it. I was reading up on, he's done almost everything Bob Clark's done as well, but just reading how he got the sounds in it, like tying forks and knives to the piano strings so it would make weird sounds as he struck them, and to like slow it down, he was pressing down on the tape player physically to get the sound to slow down a bit. And yeah, just really unique, cool stuff. Really sets the mood.
It's interesting because it's like atonal. It's like some of the stuff that you'd listen to if you were in like college in a certain time and you go to listen to like, experimental music. It's odd to listen to, but the way it pairs with the movie is so chilling and beautiful. And it's hard to not sort of compare Black Christmas to Halloween sometimes, and in the way that the music is approached is one of those ways, I think, where I think Halloween is a little bit more like slasher with a leather jacket, and in Black Christmas is a little bit more of a cerebral approach.
Well, and I think you use the word experimental, and I think that's absolutely kind of what Black Christmas is. It's toying with a form that has not yet become the cliche and the slasher that it would eventually become. The score is very experimental, and the camera work is pretty extraordinary in terms of the handheld movements, the fisheye lenses. I was thinking about that because they're shooting in an actual location in Canada, in Ontario. You have to avoid getting your cords and things like that in the shot. And they're doing all of these 360 shots and everything. So you just think about like how much forethought went into every single shot, and how are we going to do this, and how are we going to tell this story? And then on top of that, you have your cameraman basically climbing trellises and things like that. So they'd hooked up the camera onto his shoulder so that you could get all of that actually in camera. There's so many great pieces of cinematography. And that is our Reg Morris is our DP, and Burt Dunk is our guy doing most of the camera work.
Going back to characters, like I consider the house and the town itself like really important characters, especially the way it ends when it's just panning through the house, like checking each room, just chilling. Yeah, going back to just the slashers that followed, most of those are about the killer. In this, you don't really know anything about the killer. You don't know too much about everyone, but everything feels lived in, from like just the two guys on town patrol knocking on the door. Like it just makes it feel real, and like it focuses on everything that like slashers don't. I don't consider it a slasher, even though it has all of that. It's just a masterpiece.
I think when we talk about Black Christmas, we talk a lot about it as a feminist film. And for a lot of reasons, and primarily a lot of them have to do with, Jess's storyline about how she's pregnant and wants an abortion. And certainly like those are points. But to me, the thing that makes this film a feminist film. And the reason that I love it the most is because when you watch this movie, you believe these women are friends. And that is a really unique thing that doesn't, even now, movies that come out now do not successfully do, particularly in the horror genre. But you believe that these women care about each other, and you believe that they will protect each other. And when Jess goes down to that police station, when she and Phyllis is there and stuff, like, and they're looking for Claire, you're like, no, these women are going to get this done. They're going to look out for this girl, regardless of whether these cops are going to help them or not. And to me, that's the most feminist point of the film, is that these are realized women who have a very strong bond. And even though you get limited time with them, you feel that.
Kira, you mentioned the relationship between Phyllis and Barb. It's clearly a spiky relationship, and these two are not peas in a pod, but there's genuine affection for one another. They genuinely connect with one another.
Like within the scene where Barb talks about the turtles, you see Andrea Martin like really kind of entertained by Barb. Like she's smiling and she's kind of hiding her laugh a little bit, but when things turn and Barb goes a little too far, Andrea Martin's the one to be like, Barb, you're drunk.
Yeah.
Go to bed. Like, it's so beautiful.
Mrs. McHenry, our sort of house mother, who's hiding booze in every conceivable book or pocket. She's dispatched. There's a gap there. I think Phil fills that in. She's very matronly. She's very concerned. And to me, her death is the one that's the most striking and kind of tragic, because she goes to check on Barb. She knocks on the door, and then she opens it, and then you see her kind of like walk into the room. Yeah, very similar to what happens in Friday the 13th Part 2. She looks, and she kind of looks up, and then the door slams, and you know something horrible has happened. And I felt terrible in that moment, because I'm like, no, she doesn't deserve this. I mean, not to say any of the characters in this movie deserve it, but to Kira's point, I think these people feel so realized and bonded that you can't help but feel that as an audience member, like you're drawn in as an unofficial member of the sorority.
This is, I have to say, one of the strongest casts of a slasher film, even 50 years later.
Oh yeah.
With just people who have come from, that theatrical background, and like you were saying, and all that talent coming in, and they just playing off each other so beautifully. There's this chemistry between all of them, and they make it work so well. Regarding the soundtrack, how this film just takes a beautiful use of silence. They know when to leave a silent, just a silent scene, especially at the end with Jess, and everybody leaves Jess in the house all alone, and Billy might still be in the house or may not, or whatever, and we just go out and there's just silence, and it's chilling, but it's the perfect ending to this film.
It's in keeping with the quality of the police work that we've gotten up to this point.
Yeah.
You're going to leave the girl who just survived this horrible ordeal alone. Yeah, she's sleeping and she's quote unquote not going to wake up until tomorrow. But what if she does wake up and there's nobody there in this dark house? But also, you'd think the call is coming from inside the house. They've established that. You'd think they'd check the entire house. Right. And it's a cool shot of like, oh my God, there's still bodies in the attic. But I'm like, why are there still bodies in the attic, guys?
Well, I will justify this film in that regard, because Claire's dad goes into shock and they're rushing to get him out. So I feel like there's kind of a rush to attend to those who are still in need. And they do, because I also was just like, what do they do? They can't leave her, but they do station a cop outside the house.
And we saw how well that worked.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying they did what they could. But that does lead me to kind of what you were talking about, Kira, is the kind of ineffectual men in this. Like, no men managed to do anything worthwhile. It is not a great presentation of men. The only thing that anybody actually does is Art Hindle, his character of Chris. He's the one who kind of bullies his way in and gets John Saxon's attention, because otherwise the man at the front desk would completely shut them down. That's the only place where a man stepping forward and talking to another man gets the doors opened. But I
you
think,
son of a bitch, you got a big goddamn mouth.
but I think that's something that I like the fact that Bob Clark kind of puts that forward, is that the women really do have to take care of each other and take care of themselves.
I think Saxon's character is pretty strong. The guy that
But
they
he
have
doesn't
working,
save anybody. He doesn't do anything that's actually effective.
I love when he
Well-
points out the car outside and he's like, see, we got a police car stationed outside. And Andrea Martin's like, yeah, sure. And he smiles at her. That's another one of those moments where I'm like, man, not every slasher movie gives you moments like that, where like he's delighted by Andrea Martin's defiance of him. Like, it's
Well, but I
Well-
mean, here's the thing. It's not what we might come to call a typical slasher
Right.
moment. He is not
Yeah.
ineffective. He doesn't have the big moment where he rushes in and shoots the killer. You're right. But to call him like ineffectual and kind of distant, I think is a mistake. On top of that, you've got the guy that he has working in the running the wiretaps
Yep.
in the phone call center, which I think was a really kind of cool sequence.
Great
Not
scene.
something that we would see in a slasher movie. Like, here's you've
In
heard
any
these,
movie.
how to tap the phone in a movie or a TV
Yeah.
show. Here's how that actually works and why it's very complicated. Why you have to keep people in line. You always hear, "Oh, you got to keep them on the line." Like, why? I don't understand. It's because you got a guy in the bowels of this building running to check switches.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the film it is implied that they have complained about these phone calls in the past.
Right.
That they have already reported them, they've ignored them, and also, I mean, it's great that they eventually figure out that the calls are coming from inside the house. But if they had ever taken these women seriously and sent someone to their house,
Right.
it would not have been necessary to do this wiretapping because the guy was in the attic.
Right.
they even had a nickname for him.
He's the
Like,
breather.
If at any point they had searched these women's house or taken their complaints seriously, none of this would be necessary. And that's, I mean, talking about the ending, people find this ending to be ambiguous. I don't find it ambiguous at all.
Right.
She's
No.
been sedated. She's asleep in a house. We hear the phone ring. So we know that Billy's still in that house. Like, I'm sorry, we know what happens to her as
Yeah.
much as we know what happens to Phyllis. Peter is not the killer at all. That Billy
No.
is unrelated. And so ultimately that's another interesting thing about the film, because the big fight scene that we get is Jess never fights the killer. She fights Billy, or Peter rather.
Yeah.
So the killer he never interacts with Jess really, except on those
On the
phone
stairs.
calls. Yeah.
And when he
So-
grabs her by the hair.
Yes,
Which is-
and that, yeah. So, we've got they've got this person that is not the killer that they have caught, that they have assumed is the killer.
You
but
hear
here's-
Billy in the attic at the end too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's
Well-
upstairs.
I think as an audience, you're trusted to know Peter's not the killer. Everything that's happening with his aggression is more to
It's a red herring.
Jess's
Exactly.
view of him, her character, and why she would think him coming at her at the end would be him. It's not to try to fool us into thinking he's the killer. They even say when they're talking about it, Peter was with them during the first call.
Yeah, it couldn't
Um,
possibly be Peter if you look at some of the points throughout the film.
One of the things that pops up in the movie too, which is how routine the violence against these women is.
Mm.
It's like, yeah, she does have an unstable and violent boyfriend and also a killer stalking her, and also someone who may or may not be involved who murdered the little girl in the park. We don't even know if that was
Right.
Billy. That could have been some
Right.
completely different person.
I was just kind of out of college the first time I saw this, and I really wondered about the dynamic between the sororities and the fraternities. Frats, they're kind of like the big men on campus, and there's a sorority that they complain so much that the cops have just kind of pretty much put them on the same peg as like, Boy Who Cried Wolf.
There's a lot of prescience of the time, I think. That's the reason I brought up like that I'd happened to watch the movie so close to watching the Kavanaugh hearings, because it's so much about like how women are treated by men, how women are ignored by men, how women are abused by men. I mean, when I watched the movie, honestly, like my thought was always these phone calls are way too deranged. For like I saw that the movie was kind of trying to point me towards Peter, but I was always like, honestly, if this turns out to be Peter and he pulls a mask off and it's been him doing those deranged phone calls, I'm like, then this has been like ridiculous, because like how deranged those phone calls are is so beyond. I'm like, this guy can't function in society. Like, there's no way that he's, had like any kind of job before this point.
Something that resonated for me this time around is that Billy and Agnes, you get the idea, and having read into, like what the backstory is on that, Billy clearly has done something to Agnes.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the violence against women is even there. And it's something that has pervaded his life, his personality. He's been criminalized by whomever for whatever happened to Agnes, whether it was on purpose or whether it was an accident.
Mm-hmm.
But his actions toward Agnes have kind of set him on this path. And it's one of those things you just like go, wow, like you were saying, Mac, it's like there's so many layers in there of a woman's experience in this world.
There's that scene where Jess is talking to Mrs. Mack, and she's talking on the phone where she's like, no, I don't want to be put on hold. Stop. Like, no. And you're watching her side of the conversation, and you're like, man, this is ridiculous. And then it finally cuts, and you realize that she's been talking to Nash this whole time, and you're like, oh.
Yep.
I think that's something that's really horrifying about the Billy characters, that you don't see him and you don't know what he's about or what his background is. You just know it's something awful.
Real bad.
Yeah.
And that's all you can glean.
Yeah, something I noticed for the first time last night too, in the very beginning, it looks like he's just gonna walk in the front door, and then Margot Kidder's like, who left the door open? And then you see him backtracking, and then he climbs into the attic.
Mhm.
So yeah, like, that would have been a completely different movie, but man.
Oh, yeah. Do you realize this is the only door in the whole house that's locked?
Really?
Do you remember a time when it wasn't as common to like say like, hey, lock your door, to like, because that's that line in that movie always makes me laugh, because it feels like Bob Clark kind of going like, isn't it funny that we never like lock doors around here, like, ever?
Well, and also, I mean, I know this is a Canadian film that's pretending to be American, but that's also a Canadian thing. Is like, nothing bad is going to happen in Canada. But certainly growing up, 50 years ago, we were much less vigilant, let's say, about home security. There's something weird that like Olivia Hussey or I forget who it is, but they reach around the outside of the door to mess around with it, to lock it. I was like, who locks their door from the outside and then like pulls it shut? I'm like, I don't even know what's going on in Canada, but you're doing it wrong, guys.
Yeah.
Canadian infrastructure.
Well,
Somebody who wants to make sure the camera sees them do it.
I'm doing
There you go.
Yeah, the door has its own storyline, the front door, because it's open in the beginning. It gets jammed a lot throughout the movie. It's one of the reasons why Olivia Hussey doesn't go out the front door, because that door jams in the movie a bunch.
The door is the real killer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You mentioned the camera work and all that stuff. I also want to note the editing of the movie, because there are so many beautiful transitions. Like when the mother of the girl in the park, she sees her daughter for the first time and she screams. Yeah. And right when she screams, you hear the sound of the phone in the sorority house. And like, there's that transition. There's when Mrs. Mack gets hoisted into the attic, it immediately cuts to the cab driver yelling through the door, and that shot that like it's like the fisheye, and then it zooms out. Like, so many great little moments like that throughout the movie that I really appreciated.
Well, and Bob Clark had done his 2 small horror films down in Florida, Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things and Death Dream, aka Dead of Night. And then he kind of moved up to Canada, and this was his 3rd feature. And he also, like I said, he wanted it to be his last horror film. He's like, the horror films are what kind of get you through the door. But I would say that he went out on a high note for sure. And I know we could keep talking about this one, but I feel like we have to at some point switch forward into Silent Night, Deadly Night from 1984, which is a completely different film. It very much puts our Santa front and center, whereas Black Christmas is kind of set around the holidays, whereas this one feels very Christmas centric. Let's start down with Chris this time. What was your first experience with Silent Night, Deadly Night, 1984?
So I'm going to be telling on myself. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please don't report me to the FBI. I could not find it anywhere. I couldn't find it to rent anywhere. I and this was before streaming. I couldn't get it off of Netflix. I couldn't get them to send me a DVD or anything like that. So I had to go through the YAR piracy part and obtain a copy. And I watched it, and I really didn't know what to expect. All I had heard of was the controversy surrounding the film. Back when it came out in 1984, about the poster with Santa holding an axe and all of this other stuff. And when I watched the movie, I was just like, this is pretty up there, because it's pretty graphic for what I expected it to be. I expected it to be somewhere along the lines of like, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, things along that line. But when the things that happen in this film, the things that happen to Billy as he's getting older, or as during his youth, actually, it just starts on that disturbing note and it stays there. But that was my first time watching it. I want to say it was probably around 10, 15 years ago where I first saw it. And now it's become a staple that I watch it when people are like, man, what's the best Christmas horror? Show me a Christmas horror I've never seen. And I show them and they're like, oh. So, yeah.
Kira, how about you?
Yeah, so I saw Silent Night, Deadly Night at that double feature with Black Christmas for the first time, and now that has become kind of an annual tradition. But I'll say, I think I kind of did Silent Night, Deadly Night a disservice by always watching it with Black Christmas, because Black Christmas is such a masterpiece. And, Silent Night, Deadly Night, I don't view it that same way. I do really like it. But just a few days ago, I watched it on its own, I think, and I realized I think this is the first time I've ever watched this, like not pairing it with Black Christmas. And I was like, you know what? This is actually like genuinely a good movie. You think of it as kind of a campy Christmas slasher, much more so than Black Christmas is, but there's some really good stuff in there. So I was like, you know what? I have to let it stand on its own from now on.
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing it a disservice by pairing it with Black Christmas on this show. But I was kind of like, well, they're both having big anniversaries this year. It seems like a natural fit. But like you, watching them together, I'm like, oh, these do not belong in the same universe. So apologies, everybody. Tim, how about you?
I was a big slasher fan, so I got around to that. And I think at the time I wasn't too impressed. I thought it was a little hokey. I was expecting something more serious after like hearing, how the release and all that. I did see it in the theaters recently a couple times, and watching in the theater, you're like, man, this movie is sleazy. And like it really sticks with you a lot more. But so I'm a much more of a fan of it now than I was initially.
Ian?
Yeah, I saw this. I was probably 11 or 12. It was one of those sleepover movies where you got to ask your parents to rent the movies from the video store. So those old VHS days. And back then, I just appreciate it for the kills. Linnea Quigley and the antlers. Wow. Now watching it, with Kira, I appreciate this as an actual film, because there's a lot going on here. Just the way that they treat little Billy's trauma from being a complete innocent to this guy who snaps. And, you've got the one nun from the orphanage who's kind of tracking his progress as he grows, older to become an 18-year-old, and is trying to get him a job and to support him and be understanding in the way that the mother superior of the orphanage was not. There's a lot going on here, and it's truly a tragedy that I guess ultimately became a franchise, which it didn't ever need to be, even though it's set up for a sequel at the end. But yeah, it's oddly moving in when you take out all the slasher conventions, and even some of the slasher convention stuff is very well done. When you've got the cop at the end going into that little shack, going into the bowels of the thing, looking for the killer, you think, oh, he's going to get the axe in any second. It's not. It happens later on in the scene. But it's a film that doesn't feel like it should be taken seriously, but I think kind of demands to.
And Mac?
My earliest memory of this movie is seeing the poster in like the mom and pop's video store when I was a kid. I think they just hung it up. It was just like a look at what we got kind of thing. And your mind goes to a lot of things it could be. And I think my first real experience with it probably like those horror documentaries where like Mick Garris and his hair are there, just kind of like talking about like this is one of the great moments in horror history and stuff like that, and seeing clips of it. But I think I finally saw it in its entirety like in my 20s. Yeah, it's interesting to go from I also have done the New Beverly Black Christmas Silent Night Deadly Night double feature, and like it is an interesting thing to pair because you kind of go from Black Christmas where like there's kind of an ambivalence to the violence in that movie to sort of Silent Night Deadly Night where it's a lot more misanthropic. Watching it on its own this time, like you guys, I think the last time I watched it was right after A Nightmare on Elm Street, because I was watching like slashers all in chronological order that they came out. And going from Nightmare on Elm Street to Silent Night Deadly Night might be even worse than going from Black Christmas to, because you're just like, wow, that's like going from like Stephen King to Bazooka Joe or something. But there is like a lot of really interesting. I really love that shot of the keyhole on that kid's eye when he's looking through the door. I'd never noticed that shot before, and that was really cool. And there's a lot of cool stuff. Moon goon is a term that I'm probably going to be using for the rest of my life.
We were talking about Nightmare on Elm Street a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And this came out the same weekend as Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. Yeah. And I am old enough that I remember when this film was released. I remember the television ads. I remember the posters. And I remember people losing their friggin' minds that Santa Claus was a killer. And what's interesting is I think it was kind of the biggest name film that had really posited Santa as a killer. As you get older and as you watch more horror films, you realize this is not the first killer Santa. It's not even the second killer Santa. We've seen this numerous times. For everybody to be up in arms about it, it seemed a little shocking. And I think it seemed shocking to the filmmakers. You know, they were looking for some controversy. They weren't looking to be, pilloried. Clearly, cinema has lost its mind when Santa Claus is going to be a killer. If you look at where this lands in 1984, we are kind of coming to the end of the slasher movement. I mean, Friday the 13th had just had, quote, the final chapter, so we'd had this glut of from 81 to 84 slasher. And Siskel and Ebert, were every other week up in arms about it. Is nothing sacred? Now they're coming after Santa.
I mean, this wasn't just something that popped up in a video store. I mean, these posters
got
and
a
these
major
advertisements, it got a major release. So yeah, I can understand the furor. I mean, if you're taking kids to the movies and they see Santa with a bloody axe coming down the chimney and it says Santa's here, I mean, that's really messed up. And I think they wanted the controversy and they got it.
They must have had a lot of confidence in A Nightmare on Elm Street to put it on the same opening weekend as this John Saxon, but yeah, I did hear that this beat it out that weekend, but Nightmare became number one the next weekend, and then this movie was pulled.
Right. That's the thing, like the controversy, and then like TriStar. See, the thing is, like, it was sold to TriStar, and TriStar was looking to have a new slasher franchise. Like, they were looking to have a Friday the 13th. They were looking to have a Halloween, and they got it. And then they were like, sorry about that, everybody. They had absolutely put it out as a major release. But to your point, Ian, like the ads were running in prime time. They were running at times where not the target audience was going to be seeing it. And so, yes, in that regard, they did misstep. I agree.
Yeah, it's pretty strong for a slasher that late in the cycle. And I was looking, the writers and director really didn't do much before or after.
No. Charles Sellier, who is the director, I mean, he's much better known as the producer of a lot of family fare, things like Grizzly Adams and In Search of Historic Jesus and In Search of Noah's Ark. On the most recent 4K release from Shout Factory, they have numerous documentaries and commentaries, but nobody's able to really kind of nail down as to why our producer, Ian Barmack, decided to go with Charles Sellier, except for the fact that he was successful. He was successful as a producer, as a filmmaker, and they thought he would be somebody who would be able to handle this well.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, if he had a background in sort of, faith-based movies or whatever, the climactic scene in the orphanage where the mother superior is with the kids and the one sees Billy coming up to the door as Santa and he goes and he lets him in and she's like, no, don't do it. And he comes in and he confronts her and she's in a wheelchair. She's an older lady. She's been, not the nicest to him during his, coming up, but she hasn't been sort of the abusive stereotype we've seen in other movies. But she kind of makes sure all the kids are back behind her. He raises up the axe, and you can see her staring him down, and that is, I guess, a strong testament to whatever, she believes in. And you could say that it is a miracle that the cops break in and shoot Billy in the back, just at that moment. So as odd as it sounds, this is a movie that has some kind of conviction behind it and is not just wearing the clothing of the tradition or to massacre people. There's more going on here, and I think that's one of the reasons that I appreciate it on this viewing, and I hadn't, the other. And I've seen a number of the sequels, certainly not all of them, and they don't. They're not even trying at that point. I mean, half of them are just clips shows of the other sequels. Did you get the Shout Factory 4K?
I did.
How is it?
There's not a ton of new stuff on there. There's a new commentary track with my new favorite person, Amanda Reyes. So that was fun. There's just a ton of extras. Like I had gotten their previous release, and that was packed, tons of documentaries and things like that. So there's not a ton that's new, but it's absolutely, a great package.
That's what we have as well.
Real quick, because I rented it off Amazon. The kind of the unrated scenes, I guess, or like with Linnea Quigley, especially, they have those inserts of the antlers going through. Did they clean that up, or does it still look all janky?
It's pretty. You can tell when, you can tell that's the footage we didn't have in the original version. But in some ways, I actually like that because it kind of cues my head to be like, okay, that's what got cut out.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mind it.
That's what I love about him. That's what I love about My Bloody Valentine.
Oh yeah.
Like there are like serious like differences in the grain quality, but part of me is like, yeah, this is filthy, man. Give it to me.
So when this did get its release, of course, the MPAA was on high alert at this point, and so there were things that got trimmed out. And in subsequent reissues, we've seen that footage come back out. And Kira, you have this new release as well?
I do. And when we were watching it, we were trying to watch, like, because we were excited to see like the things that got cut. And the first one that we noticed, we were like, oh, look, this is like kind of grainy. This is the cut part. And then it's literally just like a scene of the manager of the toy store walking down a hallway. And then and we were like, well, glad they put that back in.
That was actually a good edit. You should have edited that before.
They had to make the cuts to avoid an X rating. So when they did get the materials to add it in, materials are just in shit condition. So that's the best it's ever going to look.
Yeah.
Which again, I'm fine with. Tim, I know you have the novelization that's most recently come out.
Ooh.
Yeah, I finished it this morning, actually. Started on Monday.
Thank you for your service.
I did it. It is very sleazy. They even managed to make Sister Margaret into some disgusting things.
What?
Yeah, she's in love with Billy. She's got a thing for his jism socks and
whoa.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. A lot more people in the town get killed. It's a Christmas town called Christmas Joy. A lot more backstory for Grandpa, and he was a strip club owner. He's been in that home for a while, pretending he's in a coma, pranking people by like shitting in their pillows and all this stuff.
Wow.
It was a fun read. But yeah, it does double down on what I believe is Mother Superior is the main villain of this story. So there is a lot of the torture going on in the orphanage, and it does to a degree take the trauma that he's going through seriously. And yeah, it was a good read. I definitely recommend it.
Well, let me actually back up because, much like was the case when it came out in 1984, where the controversy overshadowed the movie itself. Chris Scales, would you mind giving us a little lead in as to what Silent Night, Deadly Night is all about?
Well, Silent Night, Deadly Night is about a family that it's Christmas. I believe it's Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
And they're out to go visit their grandfather at a nursing home. Billy is really excited about Santa coming to see him tonight, but Santa doesn't bring presents to those who are naughty. And then he goes in, and as Tim mentioned in the novelization, Grandpa's faking. And when the parents go away, he scares the absolute piss out of little Billy and tells him, have you been good all year? He's like, well, not all year. He's like, well, basically, you're gonna die, and Santa's gonna kill you. So we lead up into a man, a robber going around, or a sadist. I don't know what he is, but he's nasty.
He's bad news.
Yes, dressed up as Santa. He eventually stops on the side of the road and gets the attention of Billy's family. They pull over. Billy sees what happens, and it sends him down a path of trauma to the point that if he sees Santa Claus, he goes crazy. And he was forced to put on a Santa suit when getting a job at a toy store when he was 18. And thus begins the adventures of Billy hacking his way through this town as Santa Claus.
There's a thing in the book that's important. I don't know if they do it in the movie, but the main thing why Billy is still going through all this, nobody ever tells him that Santa robber that killed his parents got caught or killed. So he still thinks Santa's out there, and that's why he's afraid of Santa. And then when he puts on the costume later, like he kind of like splits his personality. But
What's great about this is that you really feel bad for Billy. Like he goes
Yeah.
through not just the trauma with his family, but then he's like re-traumatized over and over throughout his childhood. And then what finally actually triggers him, because he puts the Santa suit on and he's clearly like messed up about it, and like he's clearly like losing it a little bit. But what actually triggers him into violence is that he walks in and sees someone, his coworker, being assaulted.
Yep.
And that's what causes him to kind of snap. So when you watch that scene, at least for me, I was kind of like, understandable.
Well, it's his job. It's his job to punish. He
Right.
is Santa, and he sees people being naughty, and therefore he is obliged. I'm put on the suit. I got to be the hero that I am.
I get it.
My brain does a real like Berenstain Bears thing. Every time I'm about to watch this movie, I'm sure that the thing he yells is naughty.
Yes.
Yes.
And then I watch it and it's like punish.
That's the title of the movie.
Well, he says both.
says both,
They're interchangeable. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the little boy says naughty at the very end, I believe.
That's true.
Yep.
That's true.
The
Yeah.
little brother.
And Billy also says naughty. I think when he charges in on Linnea Quigley in the door.
And if nobody wants to answer, it's fine. But how many of us were spanked or punished the way you saw in this film growing up?
By nuns or just in general?
Just in general.
I wouldn't say
had
to
a lot
that
of-
degree, but we got smacked and stuff.
You'd be surprised by the way that I'm dressed like a character from a movie and have a poster that I had a totally normal. I was treated totally normal by my parents.
All of us horror fans had no childhood trauma.
Yeah, sorry.
None whatsoever at all. Sorry. But no, I wanted to bring it up because I wanted to go back to that point about Mother Superior really being the real villain of this film, and just some of the awful things that she does to Billy, especially I think even worse than just getting spanked with a belt. The scene that just it's still even hard for me to watch is when they physically restrain him to the bed and make him go to bed, and after all this that he's been through. And they don't try to address it or anything. And is it any wonder when, an hour later he's going to chopping up people? But I wanted to speak on that and just Mother Superior as a character. And I know sure it's really done really well, but at no point in that film do you ever feel any sort of sympathy or anything for him. Maybe that's, instead of viewing Santa as the villain, maybe the purpose is maybe it's Mother Superior after all.
Well, it makes you wonder how much of the punish thing comes from the story of Santa, where he's like, Santa will punish the naughty, and how much of it is Catholic.
Right.
Exactly. That's what I was hitting at. Yep.
There is that sense of he's punished for other people's sins as well. Like he just happens to watch the couple having sex and he is punished for that as well. She insists on pushing the trauma. Sister Margaret is clearly the person we're supposed to be viewing as the sympathetic character, the one that actually has Billy's best interests at heart. And, she shuts Sister Margaret down time and again. And all of us are just like, if you just let Sister Margaret run the show, things might go a little smoother for Billy.
She didn't have the foresight to think that Christmas might be a big deal at a toy store, though.
Fair enough.
Whenever she gets the phone call and the stockroom guy's just like, hey, what's Billy doing? It's like, oh, let me give you a hint. Ho, ho, ho. And she's like, oh, you
You're
didn't
like,
really?
Oh, this could be bad. Going back to what we were talking about with Charles Sellier, the director, again, he was more known for Family Affair, and he actually didn't direct a lot of the violent scenes. That was Michael Spence, who was our second unit director and who also served as our editor. So basically, Charles Sellier knew he wasn't the right guy for the job. I think he's effective in terms of storytelling. Like, I think he does a nice job of moving the story along. And I think probably he did the right thing in terms of handing it off to somebody else when it came to delivering the shocks and stalking and slashing.
The storytelling, especially with the younger actors playing, young Billy, I think was very effective. I was very conscious of, because you've got the grandpa saying all this like creepy things and just, drooling and kind of spitting at him. And I was very conscious of those cuts. I'm like, okay, you've got the boy reacting, and then you've got, I'm sure, the actor playing the grandfather, like off in a separate room, separate day. This is just reactions. But yeah, it's done exceptionally well. When they have the younger brother, is it Ricky?
Yep.
Okay. In the establishing, moments with that family in the car, and then the Santa shoots and the car runs off the road, you got this actual like young infant child like screaming for dear life in the car. I'm like,
it's heartbreaking.
That's a bit much. It's effective, but damn.
I want to mention that Will Hare plays our grandfather, and he pops up throughout. He's a very busy character actor. I most recently saw him in Eyes of Fire. He's in that folk horror. And he's also, he was one of the members of the Actors Studio. So, and there was something about, maybe it was the clarity of this new release, but like when he's giving that speech to Billy, his eyes are like watering up and he's crying. It's like, this is clearly tough for him to know this. I go back to Dr. Loomis, being the only one who knows the truth about Michael Myers, and everybody thinks he's crazy. Like, everybody thinks Grandpa is nuts, but he's like, no, I know about Santa Claus. Let me tell you. It's a great performance, and it's a kind of like a nice kind of oddball moment. Did anybody else have the suspicion that, because I know you've got the novelization there, Tim, I think there's a case to be made for the fact that all of that happens in Billy's head, that people leave, like all the parents leave, and then this encounter with Grandpa happens, and then when they come back, he's right back where he was. So I'm not saying one way is right or the other, but I think it's an interesting way to view that scenes is this is the first time we see the snap for Billy, that he's capable of having those delusions.
Well, and he's clearly scared of Grandpa. So I think that actually makes some sense. It's that he's got this old man that he's afraid of, and they've left him alone in the room. And so he like imagines that he says something terrifying. Yeah. And what would be more terrifying to a kid than being told like Santa's going to come kill you?
So Billy is the one leaving those turds in the pillowcases.
I don't know. Billy's like 5 or something in that opening scene. I feel like I understand what you're saying, and it's kind of a cool idea, but I think there's a couple of bridges that are just a bit too far. Imagining Grandpa, saying something to him is one thing, but like Santa's gonna come and kill you, and then if that was, I think that's a bit of a leap.
Well, and that's just it. Like it was just something about watching it this time where he's in exactly the same position when they leave and when they come back. And so that's right. I think it's there if you want it to be there.
Yeah, and it's unfair because the novelization clearly paints him as the kind of guy who would do that. But I've always thought that he was that was just Grandpa, and that's awesome. I remember him as Old Man Peabody in Back to the Future the year after this movie came out. So it's proof that Silent Night, Deadly Night did not kill everyone's career.
I was just about to ask. I was just about to ask him, like, isn't he famous for being in something else? Like, isn't it a back? And I was just thinking Back to the Future, and then yeah, that's right, Old Man Peabody.
You mutated son of a bitch.
What are some folks' favorite moments from Silent Night, Deadly Night? We talked about the antler moment with Linnea Quigley, which is definitely early in her career. It predates Return of the Living Dead. But yeah, some other like highlights from Silent Night, Deadly Night.
For me, probably one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot is the soundtrack. They made like
Oh my
some
gosh! You mean the
original
fact that it's a
songs.
musical? Yeah.
Yeah, and the toy store. I just love looking at all the toys in there, and so every time I watch those are a couple of my favorite things.
I think there's like 8 to 10 original songs written
Yeah.
for this movie, which is bananas.
And you know why that was, right? Because a lot of those people who held the rights were like, "No, you can't use my song in this." Are you kidding me?
Has anyone released a soundtrack of this with all those crazy songs on it?
I don't know. I don't know.
They're on YouTube. I definitely have looked
Oh,
up.
there you go. Tim is
My
holding
God.
up.
I have to know where you found that.
Ira's toy ad in the back. I actually got this at a record store when I was in St. Louis. I don't remember the name of it.
But it's out there in the world, folks.
It is. It is.
Kira, what were you going to say?
She's gonna say, speaking of favorite moments, like there are some great kills in this movie and some very brutal ones, and then there's some that I don't like. Like it upsets me to watch the kill when he kills the coworker who was being assaulted, because her only real crime is that she's scared of him. But and my favorite movie moment in this is probably the Toy Story montage when he first starts his job, and you just get this like incredibly charming montage of him being this like helpful, friendly Toy Story employee, and you're like, wow, like it's really working out for Billy. Like, and you know it's not going to, but for a minute it's almost like if they would just give him the day off for Christmas, he could have had a great career.
It could have worked out really well for him. And also that montage is set to the ultimate Christmas song, The Warm Side of the Door.
Oh yeah.
Warm side of the door.
It's like the follow-up to the antlers scene, the Linnea Quigley's boyfriend, that tussle in the upstairs living room, and him finally, I just love that he finally gets thrown out of the window, and it's not even like down 7 stories or something. It's just out onto the front yard. He's got these huge shards of glass sticking out of him, but there's no like reaction to anywhere else in the neighborhood. Like, walking by screaming or someone called the police, and then Billy just kind of walks out of the house and he looks at the body, he's like, and he keeps walking.
After that, when he gives the razor to the little girl,
yes,
it's such a deranged, messed up thing. Like it's spotty with blood and all that, and he's like the way he smiles at her is like reassuring, and it's like, what is this moment?
And it's hypocrisy. Isn't giving a bloody box cutter to a little 8-year-old girl, isn't that naughty?
Well, clearly she's proven herself to be a nice girl, so she'll treat it with the respect it deserves.
Why wasn't she the star of the sequels?
Oh, she should have been. She should have been like
Totally.
This movie started off as a concept of a young film student, Paul Ciani, who had sent it to our executive producers, Scott Sneed and Dennis Whitehead. And it started off as a story called He Sees You When You're Sleeping. And then the title, whilst they were filming, was called Sleigh Ride, SLAY, before it became Silent Night, Deadly Night. The reason that came into my head is that there are a lot of kind of like specific moments that feel very unique to this film, either misguided or not. They feel very unique and singular, and that's one of the things I like about this movie, because I think I kind of dismissed it as being ridiculous the first time I saw it as well, but since then its charm of kind of like how wackadoo it is has grown on me over the years.
If I could say my favorite scene, because I grew up bullied, and so I'm always in favor of seeing bullies get it. And especially when bullies that are supposed to be teenagers or like 30 something, like actual kids. But yeah, it's definitely that sleigh decapitation, because you knew it's coming at some point. And I don't think up to that point, I had seen anything where, it's coming, but when is it coming? And it's just coming right during the middle of it. And the way they pull it off, and it's still coming down the hill, and the head comes down after, and his friend sitting there freaking out over it. And I'm like, yeah, that's the appropriate reaction. But I'd have to say that's my top part of the film.
This is not an original thought. I got it from somebody else, but it's called the sledding beheading. And I was like, that's brilliant.
That works.
That's perfect.
We are not going to delve too deep into the sequels because I'm saving that for another episode where we will go through the entire Silent Night, Deadly Night series. But Chris, you wanted to say something quickly about the sequel.
I mean, yes, that's my favorite scene of this film, but of course, Tim has got my favorite scene of this entire franchise on his shirt. There are a few things that bring me joy in this life than that rampage that Ricky goes on. It's so good.
Tim, would you like to set the stage of what your shirt represents?
Yeah, this is when Ricky, little brother of Billy, first kind of snaps in the sequel after they've gone through the entire first movie with clips and everything. And
the second film is notorious for using about half of its running time is comprised of clips from Silent Night, Deadly Night.
So yeah, he's kind of just walking around the neighborhood and someone's just taking out their trash and he shoots him. Garbage day. There's a lot going, and then that laugh, that ha ha ha.
Final thoughts. Let's go ahead and just circle back around on our holiday horrors. Talk about Black Christmas, Silent Night, Deadly Night. Anything else you'd like to add?
Back to Black Christmas for a bit. I just read that Malcolm McDowell had turned down the role of Peter. That would have been amazing. But I noticed something last night when I was watching it too. The Miss Mac killing. It kind of felt to me very similar to the scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre where the Leatherface kind of gets caught off guard. Like, he doesn't go down to kill Miss Mac, she kind of finds him. And the reaction afterwards, he's like breaking stuff and, he's just kind of just flustered by everything. I never saw that connection before. But other than that, yeah, I love revisiting these. It's become a annual tradition now. So thanks for having me on to talk about them.
Ian?
Yeah, Silent Night, Deadly Night is great. It still holds up.
Kira?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Black Christmas. I really like Silent Night, Deadly Night, but I think Black Christmas is in my top 5 favorite horror movies of all time. I will watch it every year. That opening shot with kind of the like slightly ominous carol bells and the Christmas lights twinkling in the snow gives me chills to this day, and I just think it's fantastic. I'm a huge fan.
Chris?
When it comes to Black Christmas, my takeaway is it really reinforces that notion of fear of the unknown. And, what you don't see might be stronger than what you actually do see on the screen. And kind of relating to two films, Silent Night, Deadly Night's kind of the opposite. It's all about what you do see on the screen. It is about the kills, but at the same time, it brings a very heavy trauma to it that really makes you kind of, feel sorry for the characters that are involved and what's going down. Both of these films are on my rotation of Christmas films that I have to watch every year, or it's not Christmas to me.
And Mac?
Well, I think I said at some point that it was like it'd be a sham for you to not have me on the Black Christmas episode. This whole enterprise of yours, Aaron, would be a sham if you didn't have me on for Black Christmas.
You see how I folded under pressure? It was pretty good.
Yeah. Black Christmas is it's such a delightful movie, but watch Christmas horror. Get some hot cocoa, pour some booze into it, get cozy, and watch Black Christmas, Silent Night, Deadly Night. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah.
We'll do our Hanukkah celebration later on.
All those Hanukkah horror movies.
Exactly. Thanks so much, everybody. This was a super fun conversation, and wishing everybody a happy holiday, happy horror days. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.